Good afternoon. I'm Alan Solomont, Dean of Tufts University's Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's Civic Life lunch with former United States Secretary of Agriculture, Dan Glickman. Many thanks to the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy for co-sponsoring today's conversation. Dan Glickman is now an adjunct professor at the Friedman School, and the entire Tufts community is fortunate to have him here. We are delighted to have Dan participate as part of Tisch College's lineup of spring semester speakers. In the last few weeks, we've hosted amazing figures like House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Dr. Anthony Fauci, and Fox News anchor Chris Wallace. Later in the semester, we'll be joined by Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, former Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Steele, former White House Communications Director and current host of Pod Save America, Dan Pfeiffer, and many others. And we're very excited to sponsor a conversation this Thursday with Stacey Abrams. Please go to tischcollege.tufts.edu/events to see dates and details for our full lineup of speakers and to register for these and other talks. Today's Civic Life Lunch is called Food, Nutrition Security, Equity, and Health in America. These issues are interconnected, and today's guest has had a distinguished career at the intersection of all of them. It is not often that I get to introduce two good friends at a Tisch event, but I do today. I've worked alongside Dean Dari Mozaffarian since he arrived at Tufts almost 7 years ago, and Dan Glickman I have known and admired for over 20 years. Dan is an experienced leader in the fields of agriculture, nutrition, hunger, bipartisan politics, and public policy. He began his public service as president of the school board in his hometown of Wichita, Kansas, and as a trial attorney at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. In 1976, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives from the 4th Congressional District in Kansas, a seat he held for 18 years. While in Congress, he was chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and a member of the House Judiciary and Agriculture Committees. Dan served as Secretary of Agriculture under President Clinton from 1995 to 2001. Since then, he's been deeply involved in organizations having to do with food and public policy. He is a distinguished fellow in global food and agriculture at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and he serves on the boards of the Domestic Anti-Hunger Group, Food Research and Action Center, the World Food Program USA, and the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. He's also a member of the boards of Issue One, a cross-partisan political reform group, and of the American Cancer Society Action Network. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, having previously chaired the Motion Picture Association of America. Dan's memoir, Laughing at Myself, My Education in Congress, on the Farm, and at the Movies, will be published this spring. It is said that Dan combines a steady sense of humor with serious reflection on his rise from the middle of nowhere to become a successful U.S. politician and the first Jewish Secretary of Agriculture since Joseph served Pharaoh in biblical times. Dan's latest distinction is having joined the Tufts University family as an adjunct professor at the Friedman School. Moderating today's conversation is my friend, the Dean of the Friedman School, Dari Mozaffarian. A renowned cardiologist, Dr. Mozaffarian is the Jean Mayer Professor of Nutrition at the Gerald J. and Dorothy R. Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy, and a Professor of Medicine at Tufts University School of Medicine. He has authored more than 400 scientific publications on dietary approaches to obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease, and on evidence-based policy innovations that would address these serious health problems in the US and globally. Before his appointment as Dean of the Friedman School in 2014, Dr. Mozaffarian was for a decade on the faculty at Harvard Medical School and the Harvard School of Public Health, as well as being clinically active at Brigham and Women's Hospital. He has served in numerous advisory roles to the US and Canadian governments, as well as to the American Heart Association, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations. His research is widely cited in the media, and he has been named by Thomson Reuters one of the world's most influential scientific minds. Thank you, Dari, for leading today's conversation. Thanks to our guest, Dan Glickman, and thanks to our virtual audience for joining us today. And now let's get started.
Well, thank you so much, Dean Solomon, and thank you to Tisch College for hosting this wonderful event. And I'm so pleased to be here with someone that I admire very greatly, Dan Glickman. And so we'll get started. We'll have a moderated Q&A discussion, and then we'll have questions from the audience. And so, Dan, first, welcome to the Tufts community, and welcome as our newest faculty member.
Thank you, Dean, and the other dean. Two deans I'm on with. I feel very honored, you know.
Well, as Alan mentioned, you were born in Wichita, Kansas. Your parents, Milton and Gladys Glickman, operated Glickman Inc., a full-service scrap metal operation. And so growing up in Wichita, Kansas with two hardworking parents, what was the first glimmer or idea that you might want to go into civic life, civic engagement, public service?
You know, it's funny. My parents were registered Republicans, but fairly apolitical. In Kansas, as is today, there weren't a lot of Democrats in the state, but they were fairly progressive, and they encouraged political involvement. But I think it was just in my genes, Dari. You know, it's like I was president of the 6th grade class at Fabrique Elementary School, okay? I was election and commissioner at Southeast High School in Wichita. You know, in college at the University of Michigan, I was the president of the senior class. And then I was also co-chairman of Michigan Students for Romney and Johnson. Imagine, that was 1964. So I always was kind of played it in the middle, but I always loved politics. I like to get things done.
Well, there's a lot of students, undergraduates and graduate students, I'm sure, listening who are thinking about civic engagement, and especially nowadays with schools and everything going on. I know so many young people, parents, who are really thinking about our schools and what's been going on. When you were 29, fairly young, you were elected by your community to be president of the Wichita School Board, which is one of the largest school districts in the country, so it's no small task. How did that experience at 29 influence the way you think about kids and schools and education?
You know, I tell you what, I had two very small children at the time, but the school board was one of the most impactful jobs I ever had, because you actually could make decisions that impacted kids' lives. And so it could be in terms of student-teacher ratio, it could be in terms of construction of school facilities, it could be in terms of complying with state and federal mandates. And in my case, I got interested in school meals. So, I mean, who would have thought that this school board member would go to various schools? There were about 125 schools, 150 schools in the district, and sit and eat with kids, elementary kids, junior high kids, and also go back into the kitchen. And, you know, remember in those days, the people who served meals in school kitchens were not very high up in the pecking order of school politics. And I always thought that was a shame. And so I got to know people in the school meals program. So I think that's it. Just kind of I'm curious by nature, and I wasn't a big athlete, so I wasn't out there playing, you know, football in college, in high school or college or anything else. And I just got interested in all the things the school systems were doing. And I would also say we were in the midst of one of the biggest desegregation efforts in the country at the time. In fact, the guy who led the effort from the government's perspective was Leon Panetta, who was then at HHS as a special assistant to the secretary. And he was in charge of integrating the Wichita public school system. And who knows, but 20 years later, he and I are colleagues in the Clinton cabinet. So the world does go around.
And I know you just moderated a panel with Leon Panetta and Andrew Card and others on school meals. So maybe we can get to that. So it sounds like, you know, and that led to being in the House for 18 years, Secretary of Agriculture, all of your great success and achievements, and we'll talk about those. But it sounds like it wasn't a purposeful journey that you said, I'm going to set out to be a congressman and a cabinet secretary. And so I guess for young people watching, what would you say about getting into elected public service? What are the first steps?
Well, first of all, I mean, you do have to have some personal ambition. So it's just not going to happen. I mean, it's like nobody's going to come to you one day and says, do you want to be a congressman? Here's the road. You've got to build that road. But you have to have some, obviously, commitment to public service and public policy. You got to be interested in issues. And in addition to that, you've got to have a personality that I think is collaborative. And my mother used to say, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a simple reason. And the ears are really important to be a successful politician. The mouth is less important, and except to eat, of course, which I know you're interested in too. But so what I did, I was coming from Kansas made it a lot easier. Look, coming from a smaller state where we only had 5 congressional districts at the time, I was a member of the Wichita School Board, which composed about 80% of the congressional district. Combining my interest in education and agriculture, which I had even back then, with personal ambition, I just worked hard to do those kinds of things that you needed to do to run for office and win public office. But it wouldn't have happened if I didn't really want to do it. It was not a side career for me. I knew I always wanted to be in politics.
That's really good to hear and understand, and to put those traits and interests together. And it's amazing how during your career you've kept those same themes of education and nutrition and agriculture. So as Secretary of Agriculture from 95 to 2001 under President Clinton, there's a lot of things I could ask you about, but I want to get to the present day as well. So I think the main thing I want to ask you about from that experience is, what did you learn as secretary about the power of the farming community and the power of the food industry in U.S. food and agricultural policy?
Well, first of all, when I had been in Congress 18 years, and I was on the Agriculture Committee those entire 18 years. And to be perfectly honest with you, I think the focus of that committee was almost always on farm commodity programs: wheat, corn, cotton, rice, soybeans, livestock, and to a lesser extent, specialty crops, fruit and vegetables. I mean, there was some involvement in the nutrition issues as well, and I was always on those subcommittees. And there was kind of a coalition that developed between the farm interests and the nutrition interests, and they did work together to establish a funding base and the authorization for the food stamp, now SNAP programs, school meals. And so the Agriculture Committee tended to be more bipartisan, even back then, than most other committees in Congress. But I got to the Department of Agriculture kind of accidentally. My predecessor, his name was Mike Espy, a very nice man, but he resigned because of ethics issues. And this was 1994. And I had also just lost my last election, which is a good lesson for folks watching this. Losing doesn't necessarily mean not winning in the future. So I was at the end of my congressional career. Mr. Espy had resigned. The Republicans had taken over both houses of Congress. And the president's chief of staff, Leon Panetta, name from the past, called me up and said, "Would you be interested in being Secretary of Agriculture?" And it kind of came out of the blue. And I said yes, not knowing exactly what I was getting into. And long story short, I had a big ally. His name was Bob Dole. He was the senator from Kansas, the Republican majority leader of the United States Senate. And I think he helped me a lot. Sometimes I think he helped me because he wanted me to get out of Kansas forever, so I wouldn't be an impediment to him down the line. But regardless of his motives, I had a lot of great allies. I had Leon Panetta, and I had Bob Dole, and I also had Al Gore. He was also in my class when I was elected. So it just happened. I mean, it's like if Espy hadn't resigned, I would have probably gone off, and who knows, I might have been dean of nutrition at the Friedman School. I mean, anything could have happened. And so life gives you lots of choices. And I was there, and I took that opportunity, and I got the Department of Agriculture. Oh my goodness, I realized this department did more than farm programs. This department did all the food safety programs. This department had the U.S. Forest Service, 40,000 employees. The largest part of the Department of Agriculture by far is the Forest Service, timber cutting. Hell, we didn't have 3 trees in the state of Kansas, and I was now in charge of all the forests in the United States. And of course, we had all the federal nutrition programs and trade and everything else. So I wasn't necessarily prepared for it all, but there was a great team already there of committed career employees, and I was able to bring on some of my own employees, and having that high performance team was really critical to my success.
Yeah, and you know, as you mentioned, the USDA people don't realize how important it is for food and nutrition programming. I think it feeds about 1 in 4 meals in the United States overall, if you put it together, 25% of all the meals. And for babies, half of babies born in this country are on WIC, the Women's, Infants, and Children's Program. But you gave a lot of wonderful color about the background and how you got there. But I don't know if you purposefully or not went around the question. So I want to get back to the question of the power of the farming community and food industry in U.S. food and agricultural policy. Did you see that as that's what's driving, you know, policy, or did you see that, because that's what people believe, right? Is it really special interest, or is it more complicated? You know, how are decisions made at USDA around these issues? Well,
first thing to recognize is that Congress over the years has largely driven farm policy, not the president, not the administration, but Congress. And in fact, the Department of Agriculture is often known as the Congressional Department. And a lot of it has to do with the parochialism of Congress and the crops, the livestock, the locations. And so I would say that Congress and agriculture and food interests are very, very dominant in farm policy. And one of the interesting things is that nutrition policy, at least as it relates to WIC and SNAP or food stamps, has always been part of a kind of coalition between farm interests and food nutrition interests, where they've worked together. In a sense, you take care of your farm subsidies, we'll take care of the programs for SNAP and WIC. We won't bother each other, and we'll support each other. And I may be making it a little bit too crass, but it's been one of the areas where in our government, it's tended to operate in a much more collaborative, bipartisan way than in other areas. Now, it doesn't mean that corporate interests and food interests don't have a big role. They do have a big role. And Congress has allowed them to have a big role as well. But that's not necessarily atypical for most federal cabinet level departments. It's like the old golden rule: he who has the gold rules. And that's true in the case to agriculture as it is anywhere else.
Well, that's really incredible, useful to hear about. And I want to get back to food. But first, after you were Secretary of Agriculture, you were the chairman and CEO of the Motion Picture Association of America from 2004 to 2010. Who was the coolest movie star you met?
Well, I would like to tell you that I knew them all, but I worked mostly with the executives of the company. So the coolest guy I met, I think, was Bob Iger, who was president of Disney, and he wasn't a movie star, but he was just an outstanding person. And I also had some people I worked for that weren't so nice and weren't so good. But, you know, I knew a lot of the directors and some of the actors. I was just thinking about Helen Mirren and Taylor Hackford were friends of ours. And she's, of course, a famous actress who won the Academy Award. And he was a director who's done a lot of different movies. But, you know, I guess I had more of the farm in me than the movie in me, you know, in a sense that and my son is a full-scale movie producer. He was president of MGM, the film division, for 10 years, and he's just gone out and formed his own production company. So he's much more of a movie man than I am. But they were very, very interesting years. And people said, well, how could you go from agriculture to movies? And I jokingly say, well, I used to grow popcorn and then I sold popcorn. It was a very natural progression.
Well, one of the major aspects of the Motion Picture Association of America is the rating system. And so I know you cared a lot about the rating system and making sure it was robust for children and families, and did a lot of work in that. And so I think it actually continued your theme of caring about, you know, kids and children. And so for the last 10 years, you were the executive director of the Aspen Institute Congressional Program. This is a program which hosts and organizes nonpartisan talks and meetings for congressional leaders. And I was, lucky enough to go to one of these breakfasts with you. And it was amazing. Like 20 congressional senators and congressmen show up and sit down and you chat with them for an hour. I mean, it's very unusual to get folks like that in a room with no script and talk for an hour. So through that work, and also your work as a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, if everyone in Congress could understand better just one or two things about food and nutrition in this country, because folks in Congress don't necessarily know all these details, right? As you said yourself, after 18 years, you arrived at USDA and were amazed at the department. If you could tell folks in Congress just one or two things that you'd really want them to know about food or nutrition, what would that be?
Well, I think two things. Number one is the relationship between food and health. And of course, you're one of the world experts in this area. But as the old French philosopher said, you are what you eat. And our healthcare system in America is largely a treatment system rather than a prevention system. And food has as much to do with health and prevention as anything else that we do. And of course, it's more complicated, as you know, than just that. But I wish, we spend, I don't remember what the numbers are, we're close to $200 billion a year in the Medicare program treating conditions relating to type 2 diabetes and related conditions. Most of those costs are preventable in terms of better consumption of food, exercise, and other prevention techniques. And so if I had one thing to do, it would increase the importance of people's understanding that healthcare in America, it relates to a large degree on what you put into your mouth. And that's just not a factor. We basically think of health care as reimbursements, a lot of insurance related issues, and of course, very necessary research in pharmaceuticals and treatment of disease. And thank God we do that, because the COVID vaccine was discovered because of our great medical research establishment. But the big missing link is this understanding of the relationship between food and health.
Yeah, and we're working at the Friedman School to try to bring that science and knowledge to Congress and to federal agencies, and you've been involved in some of that, and I wanted to ask you about that. I think that's really amazing how little appreciated that is. Poor eating is the #1 cause of poor health in our country. It's a major contributor to nutrition insecurity and health inequities by race, by ethnicity, by income, by education, and by geography. I think it's the top contributor to rising healthcare spending, which is straining federal budgets, state budgets, and also private businesses who pay for healthcare. This is a top issue for climate change and preserving the world's resources. And this is a threat to national security, as mission readiness and others have talked about. Having poor nutrition is a threat to national security. So that was all true before COVID-19. And before the Black Lives Matter movement, which really elevated these issues around equity by race and ethnicity. And so given that foundation of challenges, and now what we've learned from COVID-19 and the Black Lives movement, what do you think those two events of the last year, do you think they've taught us anything new about food and nutrition?
I think they've highlighted the role that prevention can play in helping to mitigate against disease, or at least reduce the impacts of diseases. So, and you're doing some amazing research there at Tufts, and it's happening all over the country, and even at land-grant schools, which tended to focus more on crops and livestock, you're seeing a lot more research being done in this relation of food and disease. And the same thing is true on climate. You're beginning to really understand the relationships between agriculture, crop production, livestock production, and the impact on public health, and especially the impact on climate-related issues. And so foundations are spending a lot of money in these areas. The corporate world is becoming much more interested in these issues than they ever did before. And, it just so much has happened the last couple of years just to our lives and how we live and your students. But it has caused I think a growing recognition of the importance of these issues as public policy issues to be dealt by the White House, by the Congress, by the foundation world, and by the private sector.
And you mentioned former Vice President, and some would say former President Al Gore, his interest in climate, obviously. Have you kept in touch with him in his efforts? Has he turned toward the importance of agriculture beyond sort of thinking about energy and power in climate change?
Well, he is a farmer. He lives in Carthage, Tennessee, and I have actually seen him within the last year, and he raises animals, and I don't know the scope of his farm, but he's spoken at a conference for the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research that I'm a part of, and he talked very extensively about the role of agriculture, carbon sequestration, methane emission as part of the agriculture of the future. So, when you think about him, at times he's gotten a lot of ridicule, people, when he said he invented the internet. But the truth of the matter is that he was a profoundly long-term thinker in terms of what he did in terms of getting us to focus on the environment. And his views are mainstream now. They're no longer viewed as way out in the left field.
Yeah, well, that's what I had heard as well, that he's increasingly talking about and focusing on agriculture as a really crucial solution to the climate change crisis. And so that's great that you've had that personal experience as well. And we had Vice President Gore speak at Tufts, I think, a couple of years ago and talk about these issues, and it was a wonderful event. So thinking about what we've learned from COVID-19, I think other things that are important are, the links between obviously the low income and structural racism and inadequate access to food that happens, especially during these pandemics, but also the chronic diseases, diet-related chronic diseases, and their links to COVID-19, and how much healthier we would have been during this pandemic if we had a healthier population to begin with. And so I think it's really quite amazing. And for the students on the call, the United Nations is also paying attention to these issues. There's something called the Sustainable Development Goals, which the United Nations and all the country members want to meet. And they've realized that until they address food, they're not going to meet most of those goals, which have to do around eliminating hunger, having people be healthier, addressing climate. And so there's a lot of work going on at Tufts. And so students interested in that should really look into these things. Thinking about policy, Secretary Glickman, you're part of a group of policy leaders and other experts who, working with Tufts faculty and working with the Rockefeller Foundation, have called for a new National Institute of Nutrition at NIH. And so why should there be a National Institute of Nutrition at NIH? Why is science and innovation around food and nutrition so important? And why should it be right now? Why should we make this a priority now versus waiting?
Well, certainly Tufts has been at the leadership, and so have you personally, and I've concurred with this. The NIH is a great institution. Look, much of the COVID-related work was done by NIH in terms of finding RNA, putting it into vaccines, and Francis Collins and his team have just done this tremendous job there. But on the other hand, the NIH is, again, focused largely on treatment of disease. So they have all these great institutes, the Cancer Institute, the Heart Lung Institute, others related. I don't know how many of them. There are, 20 some odd of these institutes. And but their nutrition and food, which makes up a huge portion of people's lives, does not have a particular focus within the NIH establishment. Doesn't mean that some of these institutes don't deal with it. But in terms of its role at the NIH, which is to help find cures for disease and treat and prevent disease, it's low priority. So the need for the Institute is to provide that kind of scientific and infrastructure backing so as to elevate nutrition and related prevention techniques so that we can accelerate the cures for a lot of these other diseases. We've tended to focus most of this, in the diabetes area, and I think that the director of the NIH did have a group of people at one point. And by the way, in the recent weeks or months, with your help and your leadership, I think we're able to maybe turn the corner a little bit and get more attention in nutrition as part of the NIH. But it's had basically low-level attention over the last several years. And part of this, I think, goes back to how our medical community treats nutrition. By and large, physicians and other medical care providers, with the exception of dietitians and nutritionists, don't get much education in nutrition at all. It's not compensated when you go to a physician. You know, doctor might want to spend 15 minutes with you saying, hey, you need to eat this, 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 and this, but he can't do that because he or she's got to move on to the next patient right away in order to get the reimbursement from Medicare or the private health insurance. And so our whole system isn't built for helping people prevent disease. But having this Nutrition Institute at the NIH, I think, would be a positive thing. Plus, as you know, there's a huge amount of science there that it needs to be further discovered and further implemented to be integrated in with other kinds of healthcare prevention techniques. And so I think it's a no-brainer myself, but you know, we'll see how far we can go with it.
Well, I mean, it would make sense for the National Institutes of Health, which is really our country's and the world's premier institution study to research about health, should have an institute focused on the leading cause of poor health, which is food and nutrition, and one of the leading opportunities. I think that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned reimbursement. Just last week, I was speaking to a physician in Indiana who has a very busy prevention practice of looking at patients with a range of risk factors, and she was telling me that she had 2 geneticists on her staff in the clinic that could see every patient, 2 geneticists, but no nutritionist. And she's been going to the hospital saying, please give me a nutritionist. I need a nutritionist on the staff. And they say, look, we can bill for the genetics consults, but we can't bill for the nutrition consults. So we just can't afford it. So think about that. You go see a cardiologist for prevention and you can have 2 different geneticists see you, but not a nutritionist. So this is kind of the state of affairs. So thinking about other policy, in the stimulus relief package signed just last week by President Biden, about $5 billion will go to disadvantaged farmers, including Black farmers. This is really historic. Over the last century, especially the last 50 or 60 years, Black farmers in the US have lost about 90% of their land. About a century ago, there were 1 million Black farmers. Now there are fewer than 50,000. And much of this loss of land and loss of farms is due to systemic racism, structural racism, longstanding in government policy and in business practices. So can you talk a little bit more for people who may not be familiar with this about this new $5 billion legislation and why you think it's important?
Well, you know, the day I was sworn in as Secretary of Agriculture, and I went to the front of this very imposing building right on the mall, and there were 300 or 400 African-American farmers picketing the case, picketing the problems of the Black farmers, discrimination over the years. I had been on the Agriculture Committee of the House of Representatives for 18 years, and there had not been one hearing on the issue of treatment of Black farmers. We had had lots of hearings on soybeans and corn and trade and even SNAP, but nothing on discrimination of Black farmers. So this became this again was I walked in, and my goodness, what was I walking into? And it turned out that there's this long history of discrimination against minority farmers, largely in the South, but not completely, African-American, Hispanic, and women farmers to some extent. And a lot of them had lost their land because of mistreatment by farm loan officers of the Department of Agriculture. It's a very disseminated department across the country. So a lot of decisions are made locally at the Department of Agriculture. So, tens of thousands had lost their lands, been treated poorly. So there was class actions filed against the government. We settled one, the big one. It was called Pigford versus Glickman. My name, unfortunately, remains as the defendant on that case, even until today. But I consider myself, hopefully, one of the good guys. And then Secretary Vilsack managed to settle a whole other group of cases. But a lot of these cases were barred by the statute of limitations because they were so old. So that's where this latest COVID relief package will come in, because it will provide loan reductions and in some cases elimination of the debt for a lot of these farmers who suffered discrimination over the years. But again, it's interesting. In Congress, all these years, billions and billions and billions of dollars paid out to farmers, and it really escaped a guy like me, from Kansas, because we had no minority farmers in our state to speak of.
Well, it's a long time coming, very late, and a long time coming, and I think it's really a historic piece of legislation. You know, looking back on history, in 1969, future Tufts president and founder of the Friedman School, Jean Mayer, led and organized the first and still only White House Conference on Food, Nutrition, and Health. He had the support of the president, he had bipartisan congressional support, and that was really a unique moment in our nation when the country galvanized into action around hunger. And that conference in 1969 set in place most of our current food and nutrition policies on which we still depend today. It's been 52 years. A lot's changed in 52 years. And with all the new challenges we face, chronic diseases, healthcare, equity, the economy, the environment, national security, all of the shocks of COVID-19 and the wake-up call of Black Lives Matter movement, do you think we face another unique national moment around food and nutrition? Could the country unite again around a common purpose and reimagine the food system for the next 50 years? How possible do you think that is? Is this a special moment?
I think it is that moment. And with your leadership, Tufts and others, I'm hopeful we can achieve it. And let me talk about a couple of things. Number one, the science of nutrition has changed so dramatically in the last 50 years. I mean, we know a lot more than we did back then, and the science is going to evolve even much faster. There's this new book by the former head of the Aspen Institute, Walter Isaacson, about CRISPR technology, and he's got a lot, and I worked there for a long time, and I've read parts of this book, and I'm thinking to myself, boy, I tell you, the next 10, 15 years, our understanding of the molecular nature of food is going to change even more, just dramatic, and our programs and policies need to change with that. That's certainly, part of the situation that's there. And, there are a lot of other things. Our programs, most of our programs like WIC and SNAP and school meals to some extent grew out of that conference. It was an amazing conference. It really changed the world and brought millions of American kids, particularly, to being better fed. But we still have this great divide in America between the poor and the not so poor, and our programs, I think, need to be updated to deal with that. The third thing I would say is the role of the private sector, and is that the 69 conference led by President Nixon. I mean, Nixon, when I was growing up, Nixon was the enemy. And, but imagine your president, Jean Mayer, got Richard Nixon to establish this conference. It turns back history shows Nixon did a lot of good things as well as some of his not so good things. But what we've seen is that employers, the private sector, they have an increasing role in how Americans are to be fed, and working collaboratively with the government. So all these things together give us an opportunity to bring the private sector, the medical community, the schools, the nutrition community, science together to look at the next 50 years and to come up with not to throw everything we've done away. That's not what we're talking about doing, to make it better than we're doing it right now. So I certainly support this.
Well, we'll see. I hope it happens. It does feel like there's a new moment in time, but there's a lot on the plate of the current administration and the current Congress. I've mentioned, and you've mentioned, just a couple of panels you've moderated and other things. I would say over the last 2 years, you have been by far the most sought after moderator I've seen for panels, talks, discussions on food, nutrition, and agriculture. And I think it's, of course, related to your deep knowledge and experience around these issues. But I think it's also related to your sense of humor, your really effective use of humor, your effective use of stories and anecdotes. We've already seen that today in our conversation. And in fact, your book, which I just heard about this week, the opening title is Laughing at Myself. So talk a little bit about your use of humor. How did you learn to use humor so effectively, and why do you use it so much?
Well, I think I learned it from my grandfather and my dad, who were Depression era business guys. And my grandfather was an immigrant, and my dad was raised during the Depression. And he told me life was so bad and they were so broke that they would have jumped out of the window, except they lived on the first floor. I mean, it was like you kind of like this self-deprecating humor. that you needed to keep your wits together. And then my dad told me that, and the other thing he used to say is people like doing business with people they like. And they may not like, if they don't like you, they're less likely to do business with you. And of course, that was a very practical thing for somebody who was struggling during the middle of the Depression. But I have found that a sense of humor is really key to leadership, to good leadership. And, I think to myself, and I know this is not meant to be an overly partisan or political discussion, but our great presidents have been presidents who've had good senses of humor, or at least the ones who've been able to influence people, like Franklin Roosevelt or Ronald Reagan, or certainly Abraham Lincoln was the classic example. Somebody once called him two-faced. He said, if you had a face that looked like mine, would you want two of them? And so it's like this great sense of humor has the ability to influence people. Trump had no sense of humor except to bully and make fun of other people. So the other part of this is a self-deprecating sense of humor. You've got to be able to make fun of yourself as well to show some humility. And it's a quality of leadership that is unappreciated in my judgment. And it's one of the reasons why, if you look at Washington today, there are very few funny people around. And I don't say funny just to be like Henny Youngman or Rodney Dangerfield. Those people may be too old for the people watching this show to even remember. But they're not good people who are what I call humorists in the sense of like Will Rogers or Mark Twain, who are in government. And that's a shame. We have a few. Bob Dole certainly was a mentor of mine, a Republican leader in Kansas, but really understood the power of humor in getting them to go, so to speak, getting them to do things for you. So it's just a crusade I'm kind of on. Sometimes my humor isn't always so funny. It's tougher today because one must be very politically correct, which I do my best to be that way. My dad's humor were the kind. My dad used to, when I was at the Department of Agriculture, my dad, who was a great humorist, he used to tell jokes like, I proposed to your mother in a garage and then I couldn't back out, and jokes like that. Okay. I mean, but at the same time, he used to send me jokes in the mail. And my assistant, who was African-American, used to read these jokes, and a lot of them were politically incorrect. And I said, let's get a shredder. I don't want anybody to find out what my dad is sending me. But he was from the old school. He couldn't survive in today's world, at least politically. But you can still have a good sense of humor, even in the modern era, as long as you make fun of yourself at times. That's the key.
Well, I asked very seriously, and I think for everyone listening, especially our students, it is something that I've learned and seen and watched you use very effectively. So I think it's a very important trait. And then the last quick question I want to ask, because we want to get to questions, is, you've spent time in your career in academics, the Harvard Kennedy School, Georgetown. When you decided to step down as head of the Aspen Institute Congressional Program last year, you contacted me and said, I'd like to be a professor again. And I can think of nowhere better than Tufts. So we're so pleased you've joined. Why were you drawn to Tufts, and how do you hope to interact with our students and faculty?
Well, I think you were one of the reasons, I'll be honest with you, because of your reputation and leadership. And of course, I knew Alan, even though he's not in this school, Alan Solomon, he's still at Tufts. And he's been a longtime friend, but Tufts is the premier leader in the field of nutrition education in the United States. And it combines the knowledge of food, agriculture, nutrition, and health. And so it is the kind of coordination of all the things that really interested me, at least in the field that I had been working on for so many years.
Well, thank you. Well, welcome to have you. Our first question is from Alexandria. Please introduce yourself and your school and program and your question.
Thank you so much, Dean Mazafarian. Hello, Secretary Glickman. My name is Alexandria Schmall, and I am a second-year PhD candidate at the Friedman School, and I'm in the Food and Nutrition Policies and Programs track. Thank you so much for taking my question. My question is as follows. Diets rich in nutrient-dense foods, including fresh vegetables, fruits, nuts, whole grains, and fish, remain unaffordable for many low-income families of color across the United States, limiting household access to and regular consumption of these foods. What can the U.S. government do to increase the affordability of nutrient-dense foods, such as those mentioned, across the U.S. food system?
That's a very good question. Well, first of all, it's good to see the COVID bill expanded the SNAP dollars by about 15%, and we'll see if that can be continued beyond what the Congress decided to do. And I think in terms of education, the SNAP program has basically a nutrition education component. I think it could be significantly improved. I think that people can have a nutritious diet and an affordable diet at the same time. A lot of this requires education, but not all nutritious foods are expensive. A lot of it requires a refocus on cooking and ingredients and how to put it all together, which I think we could do a much better job of teaching people those basic skills. But a lot of it, and look, a lot of it has to do with marketing and advertising. So I watch a lot of TV. If I were born 50 years ago, I don't know what I would do because I'd be glued to a television set. But when you watch television, there are two things that if you see advertised. One is cars. So the automobile industry has learned that people will buy cars because of what's advertised. And the other is high caloric, high sodium and high fat dense foods, usually at restaurants. You don't see blueberries or strawberries advertised on TV very much. I mean, there's not a lot of money in that world. And the marketing of foods and advertising of foods largely to children and people who watch a lot of television and also social media as well, is focused on eating foods that are profitable and not necessarily very good for you. And I think that's something we have to figure out how to deal with better, realizing there's free speech and everything else. But at the same time, how foods are marketed has a lot to do with what people eat.
Thank you for that question response. Our next question is from Yanlin Ren. And again, just introduce yourself and where you are at Tufts and your question.
Thank you, Dean. That was a wonderful presentation, Professor Glickman. So I'm a second-year food policy student at Friedman. My question is, what food system changes would you like to see in the United States? And how will private sector players in the United States influence food policy in the world?
Well, that's a very good and complicated question. As somebody once said, for every complicated problem, there is a simple and a wrong solution. And so this is a complicated problem. There is no one set of solutions. I would like to see our medical schools and schools of health, teaching health professionals, teach much more in the areas of nutrition and prevention than they do now. And there are some schools that are beginning to do a better job of this. There are very few questions on nutrition on the MCATs or the tests that people have to take to become doctors, and other health care professionals do a better job. But that would be certainly one thing. I think that the insurance industry and the private sector have a lot to do with this. You now see many corporations that focus on prevention in terms of their own self-insurance, how they handle insurance of their own employees, how they have, whether it's gyms or whether they have other incentives to get people to eat better. And that's a growing movement in the United States, mostly larger employers. But many employers are now beginning to understand that the productivity of their employees depends on how they take care of themselves, blood pressure and other kinds of things. And so that would certainly be, a second thing that, I would look at in terms of the food system. I mean, we clearly have a problem with poverty in America, and poverty has a lot to do, and income inequality, with various diet patterns, and we have a lot of work to do there. And that's why it's so important to keep the SNAP program and the WIC program and make sure they're amply funded. The school lunch program, school meals programs, those are critically important. There's a growing movement to maybe you make those universal so that they would become free. It's expensive to do that, but it's, from a health perspective, it's probably the right thing to do. So there's no one answer to deal with the problem that you said, but I've given you a few of the thoughts that I had.
Thank you for that question and answer. Our next question is from Melissa Gordon. So a brief introduction and your question, please.
Hi, thanks, Dari. Hi, Professor
Hi.
Glickman now. My name is Melissa Gordon. I am a third-year student studying food and agricultural policy at Friedman and also urban planning on Tufts Medford campus in a dual master's program. And my question, I was pleased that Dari mentioned this earlier with the Emergency Relief for Farmers of Color Act, and you referred to the Pigford cases too, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the experience of working through those cases and the revelation of that discrimination at that time, and I guess where you think we've come since then.
Well, I think it's a great question. We've come a long way, especially because here I was the new Secretary of Agriculture, and I was basically without any knowledge of this. I mean, I kind of knew there was institutional racism in the Department of Agriculture. I knew that particularly in areas in the South, a lot of the employees of USDA who implemented programs were not necessarily the most progressive people on race in the history of the world. And USDA was a very decentralized agency. And so decisions were really made at the local level, not at the national level on a lot of these things. And to be perfectly honest with you, the Congress did not highlight these issues over the years. I mean, and that's where much of the reforms will come from in policy, especially in the area of race discrimination. I mean, we tackled a lot of other things, voter suppression, voters' rights, housing, but agriculture production and you know, the whole issue of inequality as it affects food production and farmers, it just wasn't a very high priority until about 4 or 5 years ago. Well, I tried to make it some, but Secretary Vilsack, I think, has done a very good job of moving this along, and this last COVID bill, I think, will be helpful. But one other thing I would like to mention is that most minority farmers are small farmers. Very few are large farmers, well capitalized. Agriculture is a business that really is an extremely expensive business to be in. It requires a large capital expenditure. You know, the cost of equipment is just extremely high. So small farmers of all colors and stripes have suffered over the last 15, 20, 30, and 40 years. As the economies of scale have grown, bigger farms have grown because they're the only ones that have been able to cope with these economies of scale. Now that's changing a bit as we look at farm to market, direct marketing. There's some alternatives to the way production agriculture runs in this country, but it's still tough because, you know, if you have a couple thousand acre wheat farm in Kansas or Nebraska, that sounds like it's huge, but it really isn't when you talk about how much money that you can make operating in that kind of thing. And it's particularly tough on smaller farmers and minority farmers to cope. But the government can help do a lot of things, and so can the private sector. I think things are turning in a better direction now. People are much more focused on doing business directly with smaller farmers, and it will never feed the world, but you can help small farm agriculture if we give it the kind of attention it needs.
Thank you for the question and response. We have time for one more question and brief answer. Before we get to the last question, I just want to highlight for everyone watching, whatever campus you're on, whatever school you're at, you know, Secretary Glickman is available and interested in lecturing in courses, in serving and mentoring on thesis committees and other things, informal advice. He's already taught in Professor Griffin's, Tim Griffin's course, and he's going to be likely teaching in Professor Park Wilde's course. And so for students who are thinking about your mentoring committees or advisory committees, you know, you can see his expertise is really tremendous. And so our last question is from Jennifer Osland. And so again, a brief introduction and then a brief answer, Secretary Glickman.
Thank you. So I said, my name is Jennifer Osland, and I'm a second-year PhD candidate at the Food and Nutrition Programs for Food and Nutrition Policy and Programs. And then I work at the human HNRCA. One thing that I've realized is when I've jumped into the Friedman world is how there's a lot of policies and programs that can be effective for addressing food and nutrition security. But I've also learned that it can become very politicized and hard to develop those coalitions or actually get them implemented. So my question is, in our current political climate, what do you see as national policies or programs that could feasibly be implemented to address the national food security or nutrition security?
Excellent question. And let me say, first of all, a lot of the solutions can be community-based. They don't have to be national-based, although you do need seed money in many cases to provide, direct marketing, or there are other food prescription programs, or there are some organic agriculture programs can be done locally. So a lot of the best practices that can be scaled up are actually happening locally and then blossoming upwards rather than from top down. So that would be one thing I could say. Our farm programs were, frankly, after the Depression, not designed to help smaller farmers. They were largely focused on 5 crops: wheat, corn, cotton, rice, and soybeans. Those crops all take a lot of land, a lot of inputs, a lot of water, and a lot of money to make a living, because with disasters and everything else. And what happened over the years is those programs became ingrained in agriculture, and you couldn't grow other crops on that land, like specialty crops, like fruits and vegetables, because the law was written to protect fruits and vegetable producers in California and other places. So we didn't want to grow, let's say, grapes or stone fruit in Kansas on wheat land, because that might compete with the West, and vice versa. So the farm programs were not very pragmatic or flexible. That's changing in recent years. And with the advent of new crop insurance and risk management techniques, we're now growing all kinds of crops everywhere. Even if you couldn't grow, for example, for a while, if you grew stone fruit on your wheat base, it's a little complicated, you would lose all your wheat base payments. So what was the incentive then? You didn't grow a comprehensive set of crops. That's changing a lot as we move into more flexible risk management and crop insurance. And that's a real important point I want to make. For agriculture, we're so susceptible to weather and trade dislocations that you have to have good insurance or risk management, or it doesn't work. One bad year, it spoils the whole crop. One tornado, one giant flooding, and you're dead as a farmer. So that's why agriculture is so different than anything else. So I guess my point is that we're learning. I think there's more attention and more focus on trying to make production agriculture more suitable for big, medium, and small, and not just big. At least that's my hope.
Well, thank you so much for that question. Thank you so much, Secretary Glickman, Professor Glickman, for attending and spending your time with us for this last hour. Thank you to Tisch College and Dean Alan Solomon for hosting this wonderful event. And we look forward to hopefully a special moment in time, a unique moment in time, both for Tufts and for food and nutrition in this country. So we really appreciate your time, and thank you for everyone for joining.
You're welcome. I really enjoyed it.